Welcome in. If you're watching this video, you're probably pretty familiar with the 40K setting. It has some of the absolute best world building in the sci-fi fantasy genre. Now it has insane lore, hundreds of memorable characters, if not thousands. There's way too many to keep track of. It has a really distinctive design and honestly a hell of a lot of churches. Design and architecture of 40K is a huge contributor to how we immerse ourselves into 40K and how we get into this setting. The design and the world around it is something that encourages purchases of minis, terrain pieces, building of dioramas that are absolutely out of this world. It's just such an intensive and inspiring creative community, and it all starts with the setting, buildings, the places people live, the history and the lore behind it is all fascinating and depressing and so cool. And I'm here today to talk about how it relates into our own world with the Gothic architecture that 40K uses. Now, why is it so good? Why is this extremely bleak Gothic architecture so appealing and inspiring to the fan base and the millions of people that draw inspiration from Warhammer? Well, first, history lesson. We have to understand what this architecture is because it definitely draws on real world architecture in order to relate it back to the 40K setting. I am no historian or architect, so I'm going to do my best to talk about what Gothic architecture is. When understanding Gothic architecture and why it kind of itches our brains, I think a good place to start is, why is it called Gothic architecture? This is something I've always honestly questioned. Why is something Gothic? Why is Bloodborne setting considered Gothic? Why is Warhammer considered Gothic? What is Gothic horror? The word gets thrown around a lot. And why is it Goth? In the history context, the Goth or Gothic folk were actually a Germanic tribe or clan, I guess would be the more appropriate term, and they existed around the 300 and 400 ADs. They are responsible for starting medieval architecture, essentially. Not like Romanesque architecture, which we'll talk about in a second, but like our traditional Gothic architecture, such as like Notre Dame. So the Goths pioneered all this. They kind of rebelled against Roman rule. Well, they themselves didn't call them Goths. It is actually a derogatory term used by classist Italians that were pretty much upset that their architecture and design was better than theirs, and they would use it as a sort of slang word to be like, oh, that building is so Gothic, as in calling them barbarians. It wasn't nice, but it has transcended that meaning and it is very different in our today's culture. But back when Gothic architecture was starting, the term started as an insult to the buildings, which, I don't know, I thought that was interesting as hell. Never would have thought of that. Now, what makes Gothic architecture? Why is it Gothic? We know who started it. We know who the people are. They were the Goths. The term Goth is highly ironic by today's standards. For example, if I were to say the word Goth and have you close your eyes and imagine what comes to your head, you are probably imagining like typo negative, hot topic, smoking cigarettes behind your high school, that kind of thing. But if I were to tell you that the meaning is the total opposite of that dark and edgy stuff, would you believe me? Because it totally is. I had no idea. The word Gothic actually refers to this. Now, the main feature of Gothic architecture and its purpose is to basically maximize space by building up the exterior building so that the interiors can be very spacious and full of light. Really funny that they use Gothic architecture in the Warhammer setting that is so dark and bleak, and even coined the term grimdark, when the whole purpose of Gothic architecture is to lighten a room and make it more beautiful. How did they do this? Well, it's actually pretty interesting. So there are two kinds of arches that existed back then, probably more, but the two main ones we're going to focus on. There's the Roman arch that is circular, and then there is the Gothic arch, which is more triangular. It comes up with two curves, meets in the middle to form a triangle. The Roman arch, if we're to get into geometry, circles aren't very strong. They aren't very supportive. All the weight goes down straight into them. And so when you look at Roman architecture, or Romanesque, that uses the circular traditional Roman arch, all the columns that surround it are fucking massive. They are huge because the arch itself cannot support a lot of weight. So these columns are required in order to make sure that the arch doesn't collapse. Now, with the triangular or pointed arch as used in Gothic architecture, triangles are stronger because it distributes the weight differently. If you were to build anything, I highly advise you to use triangles as your framing. It is much more effective than just building a square or a circle. So with this pointed arch, there is able to be more weight put on the arch itself. Now, with more weight on the arch, there is less need for massive columns. So the columns were able to be thinner and taller, lifting the roof, making the interior space bigger. And with the higher roofs and the pointed arch, all buildings need ceilings, they were able to have a vaulted ceiling that essentially followed the structure of the pointed arches. So the ceilings were almost triangular, and so the ceilings themselves were actually stronger than the circular rounded ceilings coming off of Roman architecture. We have pointed arches. Pointed arches support more weight. More weight means smaller columns. Smaller columns means more room inside. Now, these two things still probably wouldn't be supportive enough on their own, especially for buildings the size of Notre Dame and the scale. So there needs to be extra support, which is where the flying buttress comes in. So flying buttresses are actually detrimental to these Gothic buildings. They are one of the main supports. So in order to save space and make sure that the walls aren't bearing weight, the supports are on the outside of the building. This is where the flying buttress comes in. They jut out of the side of the building and help basically add strength to these walls so that instead they can have glass for walls. So all the weight is on the arch, it's on the columns, and now the flying buttresses are adding structural support to all of this. Without any weight needing to be bared within the walls, they had room for stained glass. So stained glass is one of the mainstays of Gothic architecture. Stained glass was really important because back during when the Goths were making all this, a lot of people were illiterate, but they're also really Christian and they wanted to spread their message. With the stained glass, they were able to put images and stories in the glass itself and then put it within their cathedrals, churches, state buildings, and they were able to, one, help people understand their religion, and two, it was kind of a form of propaganda. They were essentially billboards for Christianity that allowed people that couldn't read the Bible to understand what the story was. So now, relating that all back to 40K, this is where things get interesting. So now if you've made it this far, you're like, how the hell does this relate to Warhammer? I am here for Warhammer and 40K, not this history lesson on architecture. Well, I think all this is really important to understanding how this relates into 40K, because we have our real world example. We have people that were trying to maximize their space and show their religion. And in the setting of 40K, if you're familiar with it, we have something called the God Emperor. So the God Emperor is everywhere, and also 40,000 years in the future, humans really fucked shit up, and there's not a lot of space for stuff now. So having really strong buildings for hive cities is very important. We won't be going into what a hive city is today, but basically think of it as a giant ant colony for humans if you're not familiar with what a hive city is. Now, a lot of this Gothic imperial architecture is found within the hive cities, partly because they're massive. They home millions of people. There's not enough space for everybody. It is to the point where in a fully realized hive city, the people that aren't at the top likely have never felt the air or the sun of their own planet. They are just hidden within this massive structural city. When a hive city were to start, it would make sense to make very spacious buildings that Gothic architecture allows, having those small columns. And we also know that the Imperium is highly religious. They love the God Emperor. They are always preaching about the God Emperor. It would make sense to have these very structurally sound buildings that would, in theory, be safe to build upon and allow glass for the walls in order to still show the God Emperor and his story. The hive cities take the building to an extreme. It kind of bridges away from Gothic architecture depending on where you are in the hive city. As in the lower levels, they're so cramped for space. It's modular. People have built onto their own homes and buildings, and it's all very cyberpunk dystopian. Now in the upper levels, there's these massive spires just reaching for the sky that the elites live in. They're the only ones that get sun and light and air, basically. It makes sense that they're reaching up towards the sky. I think it's very interesting how the Imperium draws on this real world setting. It makes it almost more dark when we dig into it. We have these buildings that were designed to promote religion, make everything very light, create tons of space, and they took it to such an extreme that they just kept building on top of it, making more light, trying to house everybody, that eventually they got so high that there's just nothing left to build and there's no space for anybody. They literally flew too close to the sun, trying to get as much as they could and trying to make sure that people have light. They ended up blotting it out. If we're to get really metaphorical, it's very much like Icarus flying too close to the sun for his own good. With all that information, I just wanted to make this video to say I love the architecture and setting in 40K. The Imperium of Man is certainly the most prominent within the setting and draws on the most real world parts. A lot of people attribute it to Roman architecture, but I really believe it draws more on the Gothic elements of the architecture. I started looking into other factions for other videos I could do on their architecture, and it's really hard to find anything, but if you enjoy this, let me know, and I'm sure I can scrounge something up. I thought about the Eldar, but when I looked into what potential architecture they have, my god, it was just fantasy bullshit. Just like, it was all spherical, looked really sophisticated, but would probably blow over in a gust of wind going 10 miles an hour, just like the Eldar would. So I guess it correlates with how the Eldar function, but it was really boring to look at and try and research, but I'm sure I can scrounge the internet to find something. I thought doing the orcs as well, just because it's Orktober. I thought that would be very fun, but it is basically just a junkyard for their architecture. So if anybody has any resources or knows of anything else they want me to cover, please leave it down below. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this video, and if I got anything wrong, please correct me down below. Also, if you want to check my sources, those will be in the description. Thank you all. I hope you have a wonderful day.